We all good? Good. I'm just going to fire up my clock so I'm roughly on time. So firstly, thank you very much to Aaron Phillips and the rest of the Newcastle University for organising this today and for inviting me to come and talk with you guys. My talk's about simplifying performance for athletes and for teams. And I set up a company called Invictus International, and we work with Olympic, world and national champions and have done so for like the last 4 years. And what we look at doing is taking athletes to the next level in simplifying how they actually utilize a process and how that process then in turn impacts the performance and the results that they do along the way. Oh, my little clicker isn't working. There we go. And each year that we have worked with them, we've only been up and running for 4 years now. Each year that we've worked, we've attained at least a national title, a European title, or a world championship title along the way. So that's helped create a little bit more momentum and people actually being a bit more interested in how they can apply themselves mentally and what the returns can kind of be off the back of it along the way. Usually a lot of athletes come to us and we always ask them for like a little bit of feedback on what they perceive as kind of what's bringing them obstacles. And very few athletes are very poor at addressing this type of stuff, and it's the same within the coaching environment. Usually it's left to, well, you have to figure out on your own, or if you're too hard to manage, then you're too hard and someone else is going to come and take your slot along the way. But the biggest things that athletes have kind of brought to us is inconsistency, and that's how they're going to be within their training or the results that they've got along the way. And this is a big disruptor within what they condition mentally. Them overthinking either what their attention is on, or either overanalyzing stuff along the way as well, so they can actually get too bogged down in the detail of them reviewing actually how they're doing stuff and nitpicking on things and actually missing maybe some of the big fundamentals along the way. And then the last one that we got is actually them creating a bit of self-doubt in themselves, either doubting how they're going to be able to perform, or even doubting in how they're going to be able to turn up that day or deliver some form of performance. And this is just like a general summary. We always get questionnaires from any athletes that we work with prior to starting with them, and that's from hundreds of athletes over like the last few years. But these are the generalized kind of main topics that are inhibiting athletes along the way. So we're never assuming that we know what the problems are. It's always good to get it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. Now, the big thinking contributors are that they kind of pin the tail on the donkey a little bit more, is that they feel that sometimes they're failing if they're not always constantly progressing. So the dialogue is going to be, I failed today, and if I don't hit a PB, or if I don't go faster than what I did the day before, or if I'm not getting better stats than the day before, then I've moved back along the way. Equally, at the other end of the scale, where it's very successful, you can equally see complacency kicking in. And this is also a huge inhibitor, because it basically blindsides the athletes that are quite successful in thinking that their performance will just automatically happen again. But thinking that something's going to happen doesn't tell you how to do it. It just kind of eludes you into thinking that you're better than what you are. Then the other bit along the way that definitely I was a huge culprit of whenever I was a full-time athlete was that I thought most athletes think that they have to be able to figure things out. And it's the same thing with the coaches and all teams. Like, they think I should be able to do this on my own. Like, I don't need help. I don't even have a problem. Sometimes we don't even go into environments where they even have problems. It's just they want to make things better. But there's always a sense of, no, I can figure this out on my own, which is quite limiting in them expanding how they can think a little bit more. Expectations, the next thing. So expecting the fact that they're doing all the physical work and all the technical work and all the conditioning, that's enough, and that's all I need to do. And putting all that time in is going to help me. Yes, it will definitely contribute to them getting better, but an expectation that that's all that they need to do, and that expectation will then lead to them getting a gold medal or winning a championships. It doesn't quite work out in that, and I've heard so many times, I expected this to happen, and then something very drastically different happened along the way. And then this can also arise, like one of the main contributors is actually people just underperforming, people waiting until they get a problem, until they actually need to fix it along the way, which is unfortunate because they're basically waiting until their house is on fire, and then they call the fire brigade to say, oh, can you come and put this out, please? So these are some of the thinking elements that kind of identify and jump up along the way. And the main kind of elements that we can kind of see that are adrift. It was really nice to listen to the previous talk, the tail end of it there, because it was like, this is some of the stuff I do, but I'm not really an academic, and it's quite nice to hear it, how it's been put together. Is that there's no way in which their processors are being audited. They're not sitting down and reflecting, or they're not even talking about what mental processes are at play, either in a day-to-day process or even whenever they go and do like a performance. There's multiple versions. So we work with athletes to build one version of how they turn up. So it's not like this is the way that I do it on a race day and this is the way that I do it in training. And equally, oh, today was just like a really bad day, and they're like an angry bairn throwing their toys out of the pram whilst they're at training. I remember I worked with in professional rugby, and they played like an unbelievable match one Friday, and then 4 or 5 days later, all the players, I don't work with the team, I work with one player, and all the players had to be sent home because somebody brought their baggage to training that day and ended up fighting with the rest of the team. So the training was then cancelled. So that's a bit more than one version. The sustainability of this as well. So do they have a sustainable model on how they can kind of keep indefinitely growing and incrementally building their performance along the way? And then actually understanding, do they understand like what they have, and actually how they can then condition that along the way? Because I certainly knew that what I thought I knew was contributing to my performance definitely was not. Elements of it were, but there was such a lot of stuff that was amiss along the way. So one little thing that we usually go in, it's not quite as technical as the previous one, we don't show them weather maps, but we've got a weather map, is that we like to assess the conditions that's kind of on the ground, because there can be so many, not only just in their training and in the sport environment, but there can be so many things that contribute to how an athlete like grows and how they develop. I was only speaking to an athlete the other day who's a very high level and well recognized performer, and they're at university and they're competing on the world stage. But it's sometimes they're going to have the perfect sport environment, but it could be something else outside of that that will be a contributing factor to inhibiting them along the way. And it's very important to understand actually what's the train like for them, and for them actually to see actually it's broader sometimes in the area that they're just looking to perform in, and how simple are they doing in other aspects, because whatever's being collated along the way is going to be the stuff that creates like the kind of big mass that's going to move it forward. And whenever you can identify what's fueling this thing and equally the direction you can push it in, you can do some very interesting things with it. Whereas most of the time, people aren't really aware of what's fueling it, and the direction that's going in can just be really irregular. Can go one direction 1 minute and then off the other way the next minute. So one of the first things that we get athletes to do, and teams and coaches, we work with all three of them, is to actually assess what's going on and to actually notice actually what's the current conditions. And for them to understand the current conditions, they need to actually know, as I said before, like what's actually fueling this thing. Like, how are you turning up? What are you focused on? What's your attention on? And how good are you at keeping your attention on certain things? And a lot of people, most athletes only assess like the times that they're doing, or the scores that they're achieving, or the margins that they're winning by, or their PBs that they're doing, or weights that they're lifting along the way. And that's certainly what my attention was on when I was an athlete. But they're very rarely do they look at actually, how am I turning up today, or actually even who's turning up today, because sometimes they can be there physically, but mentally, as I kind of explained the other day with the rugby players, they were slightly in a different place. And when they brought that to training, the whole professional team was sent home pretty quickly. The next aspect that we look at as well is the range of which they operate. So an easy snapshot of that is actually, well, if we asked you to say, like, how would your coach describe you on a good day in one version, and how would they describe you in a bad day on the other version? That's the range that you're looking, that's the range in which you're operating in. And how does that how's that working out then for performance along the way? And we don't do much else than that to begin with. And then equally challenge them. They're looking to become better and to create something that's stronger and sustainable. But a lot of athletes' journeys are like roller coasters, and we don't make them perfect, but we certainly show them how they can attain a trajectory by being smarter with how they work and creating like a simple model and being smart and sustainable in reviewing, actually, this is what's working, this is how I'm doing it, this is what's challenging, and this is how I'm adapting for it, or how I will adapt for it along the way. And this is done in a day-to-day process. So it's like if you've got a model that works very well, it's like doing a running race with 2 legs. And then if you turn up on a bad day, it's like you're trying to do your running race with 1 leg and you're hopping along. Both of them still work, but one is significantly more efficient than the other. And yeah, you'll see this in probably I don't watch football, but I'm sure it's happening in the Euros, and you'll see it in professional rugby, and no doubt we're going to see it very, very soon in the Olympics as well. The thing that we ask athletes to do after that, and teams, once they've assessed, isn't even to change anything, but just to notice. So what do they notice? What do they notice now that they're aware of kind of what the rough makeup is? What impact is this having along the way? Because obviously, like if you see the little bike wheel on the screen there, even if you look at character traits, an athlete that's consistently pretty level, composed, able to be attentive on the present moment and keeping things simple. Think of those like green spokes. An athlete that's very talented, but they're easily frustrated, get anxious, get worried, get stressed out about the future, get complacent. Think of those like yellow or red spokes. And if one of those spokes hits a bump in the ground, it can buckle the whole wheel, and then the whole thing can stop quite quickly. So it's not very simple. And equally, if an athlete has conditioned character traits that are sustainable and durable, so it can take the rough with the smooth, then it means the wheel is created with green spokes, and it can endure not a smooth journey, but it can certainly take the bumps along the way. And this year is such a good example of that, because there's so many athletes that that had tough journeys and getting selected for this Olympics multiple times, and Olympics being called off and everything else. And then we look at what are the athletes actually sharpening. So this is where we get into actually conditioning some of these things along the way. And we ask them what's their attention on. And the attention fundamentally has to always come down to what you're doing in the present moment. Many athletes get caught up in what they did in the past, and they live in the past. And equally, they sometimes might be caught up in what's happening in the future. But to make it really simple, you just have to notice actually what's your attention on in this moment. And it could be as something as, hey, my legs are hurting, or man, I've got a long way to go in this race. Or it could be, I'm going to keep breathing here, I'm going to keep this light, and I'm going to keep my feet lifting and moving. And it sounds like simple dialogue, but it's very, very important that athletes and people know what to focus on in the present moment. As a consequence of doing this, they're very good at, we don't layer up athletes too heavily, to be honest. We get them to do it once a week to begin with, and then progressively they can condition it. So each time they go to train or they go to perform, they'll ask themselves a simple series of questions that will help strengthen this method, and then it will condition over time. And then it's all very well building this behind closed doors, but you have to challenge it so that athletes are very, very used to being present and being focused on their simple process, and they're aware of what works and how to do it. And the feedback that we got from athletes along the way is that they got better clarity on what they were doing and how they were able to operate. It brought them greater confidence in what they had built and tested and what they understood about themselves. And then also the simplicity. So there wasn't a big range of how they were performing or how they were turning up, whether it was training or it was an Olympic final. And this was the general feedback from what athletes and teams have given us so far. And why are we doing this? Because we want to help athletes know that they can understand themselves and they can take ownership of how they're performing. And actually it returns a lot more for the time that they're applying themselves. And it can be strengthened, as opposed to this was just a good day or this was just a bad day and I'm not really sure what went on. And then the whole thing that this revolves around is actually, well, how they're performing. And whenever you can understand how you can perform and maintain consistency and develops a sustainable way to make that better, it helps change the game of what you can achieve along the way. Cool. That's my talk, guys. So thank you very much for listening, and hopefully everyone was fluent in Northern Irish and understood most of it. I'm very open to any questions that anybody might have.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That was fantastic. Is there any questions from any of the listeners? Feel free to jump on the mic if you do have a question.
Yeah, I was just going to sort of ask you, so what sort of methods do you like implement with your athletes? I know I've sort of understood it that you sort of educate them on these certain things. And I know you mentioned about like conditioning with your athletes. So is this sort of like, does this go on throughout the whole season? Or is this kind of like a one-off or a couple of weeks where they just sort of, you know, see that change and feel that change? So is it like, yeah, is it a more short-term process?
Do you only do weights for like 1 week and then you're strong for the year, and then you've got like, then I think with this stuff, the moment that anybody thinks they know everything, they'll stop learning. Whereas whenever you're like a kind of an open student, I was certainly a huge culprit of thinking that I knew everything as an athlete, which was so inhibiting. But whenever you're actually, I can learn more about myself and how I operate, and that's an indefinite process. Like I was chatting to guys that are going to the Olympics in a month's time and working with them for over a year, and they're still learning how they can keep things simple, because there's always little bits of dialogue that might pop in and take your attention away from what you're doing that day. Oh damn, the Olympics is in a month's time, are we doing enough training? It's like, just listen to what you're saying there for a second, and what does your attention need to be on today, and what have you done to date, and how has that worked out for you? And then it brings them back to what they're doing that day. So this is something that's ongoing, because as I said before, you can always be a student, and whenever you're open to learning, you'll move on to the next level. But once you think that you know everything, you'll probably stop learning.
Perfect. Is there any more questions from any of the listeners? No. Okay, I've got a question. If you could get a coach to do one thing differently tomorrow to simplify the process involved in their practice, what would you recommend?
Sit down and talk with their athletes about what's working well and how they're doing that, and then ask them what the athletes are finding challenging and how are they adapting for that, or how will they adapt for it. Because there's just so much attention on the physicality and the technical aspects of it, but they're never the only time something's addressed mentally is if something goes wrong. Which means, it's, as I said before, it's like wait until the house is on fire and then saying, how can we stop this amazing thing from burning down? So I think whenever that's done, it will at least help maintain what you've got in position, and it'll teach you things actually, well, this is what's working. Maybe even they'll be giving feedback to the coach, or feedback to each other, or feedback to themselves. Whereas it's never verbalized. I find it, I'm shocked by it that it's not done, because I was part of a national team and we didn't do it. And I equally work with people on that level now, and they kind of do it, but it's not very structured. It's kind of haphazard. So if it's done weekly, at least you're able to maintain like good stuff that you're doing, and it ensures that new challenges kind of accrue and kind of accumulate over time. And then they're bringing the coach a big giant problem, saying, oh, I've been doing this for like the last 3 months, can you help me sort it out? And it's like, well, if you're doing it on a week by week basis, it's kind of like tidying your house once a week. It keeps it efficient, and it's easy to maintain in that way. Whereas if you don't tidy it up, it'll get pretty messy quickly.